I got a question from a member of the audience, and it deals with telling the truth. It's very easy to think of telling the truth as a strength, but I think most of us here on the internet are telling the truth from a position of weakness. We are clinging to the truth because it's all we've got. When I first went to Cambodia to do humanitarian work, I was a critic of several of the humanitarian agencies there. So, we're talking about wealthy, white people, almost entirely European, who'd come to Cambodia, set up agencies, denounced and criticized the Cambodian government, and they got kicked out. One way or another, the Cambodian government got rid of these charities as unwanted criticism. And when I first got there to Cambodia, I was very critical of those groups. Did you come to this country to help poor people just because they're poor? Or did you come to rub the government's face in your sense of moral and intellectual superiority? And you know what? Maybe you do know better than the government of Cambodia. You, with your Cambridge education or your Oxford education, your Ivy League education, you know what? You're rich and you're white and you're Western. You may know better about all kinds of things. When I lived in Laos, I seemed to know more about sewage treatment plants than the people in the Lao government, and it drove me crazy. I seemed to know more about ecology and all kinds of things I cared about. But I didn't feel it was my place to, in that disrespectful and accusatory way, point the finger, even if I were right. And here's the thing. For those agencies with that money in that position of privilege and power, okay, it would have been more powerful for them to lie, for them to remain insiders, for them to play the game. They could have influenced the government. They could have brought about real change. And they could have brought about real change just through their own humanitarian agency, their own organization in Cambodia. And instead, they got their asses kicked out. They became exiles because they wanted to tell the truth. All right? I was younger then, And when I'm looking at that, so what do you really care about? This is before I knew about YouTube. Probably YouTube existed then, but it was in the early days. So what? Do you want to be like a radio talk show host? Do you want to be like a YouTuber who comes to Cambodia and points the finger and says, this government official is corrupt and that government official is corrupt? And you're probably right. I can't just say these NGOs were 100% right all the time, but whatever. They're probably 90% right 90% of the time, or whatever it is. There's a lot of corruption in the government. The point is not that I disagree with the critique, but did you come here to be a critic? Did you come here to be a radio talk show host? Or did you come here to give clean running water to people who don't have clean running water, and build homes and put roofs over people's heads and teach people how to do a job, or offer them education or literacy or whatever it is? What is the point of what you're doing here? Okay? And as soon as you get on that path of compromise, right, then you start asking yourself another bunch of questions. Okay, so let's say you care about helping the poor and you care about helping the downtrodden and providing them with running water. Okay, so now, how many lies are you willing to tell? How much government corruption are you willing to cover up? Are you willing to stay silent about? How many people get killed? How many dead bodies? How many people disappear? See, when I was younger, I didn't understand that side of the game, right? I saw, look, you can compromise and be a power player inside and get results and work with the government and work with corrupt companies and things too. It's not all government. It's primarily the government. Maybe, maybe there's a local sugarcane corporation or something you got to work with too to achieve your humanitarian goals. Okay, you can play it cool and be on the inside and get results, or you can be like a radio talk show host who every day is saying, you're corrupt, you don't know what you're doing, you're incompetent, who's a critic, and you're an outsider, and you can accomplish nothing. You can't bring about any real change in the world. And then, you get to indulge your sense of moral superiority and intellectual superiority. But you've ruined yourself, okay? I'm older now. I'm more mature. And I understand there are a lot of other questions. There are a lot of other questions here that are at stake, right? And the most fundamental, and the one you have to deal with every day, is who am I? When I wake up in the morning and look in the mirror, who do I have to deal with? Who do I get to be, right? And maybe it's just one dead body. You know, maybe you're not covering up a whole lot. Maybe it's just 2 or 3, corrupt government officials. It may not, may not be that terrible, the things you have to do and the scale of things, but you're the guy who did it. And that's what you're looking at in the mirror when you wake up in the morning. Whether it's just a few murders or a few bribes or a few covered up disasters, controversies, or what have you, right? Who are you going to work with? If you're a coward, if you compromise, right, it's interesting. You find yourself surrounded by cowards. You're living in a culture of cowardice, right? If you're a hero, if you're a person of principle, if you stand up and tell the truth, even if it gets you kicked out of the country or even if it gets you killed or whatever, you find yourself in the company of heroes. It's interesting how those things gravitate together, right? So I now look back at that in a very different way than when I first arrived in Cambodia. And you know what? Both matter. Both the real world outcomes matter and the truth matters. Doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do matters. And it really does matter whether or not people have clean water to drink. It's not one or the other. It's got to be both, right? But the tragedy of human life is, at what point does doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do become a pretext for evil? And it happens. Okay. I got an email. I'm not going to read it out to you. Got a message from someone actually on Discord, viewer of the channel. He's asking me, is it worth it to stand up and tell the truth to people when you really fundamentally morally disagree with them? He gives 2 examples from opposite ends of the spectrum of seriousness. One is standing up to and confronting people who really do support Anissian. So Anissian's a YouTuber with storied love life here on YouTube and various ethical transgressions we all like to criticize. Okay, is it worth it to stand up and tell the truth and confront those people? And the opposite example he gives is standing up and talking to neo-Nazis, white supremacists, racists, and people at that end of the political spectrum. And he outlines some of the sort of psychological and political problems with creating these conflicts, and won't that just make the people you're opposing more embittered and self-pitying and want to have various kind of negative consequences at that end rather than positive consequences? Won't it bring more public attention to the people you're criticizing rather than ignoring them or what have you? All right. My channel has basically been blacklisted on YouTube since I stood up and pointed the finger at a series of racists, white supremacists, and neo-Nazis. All right. And I know most people on YouTube care about success. They care about earning a living on this platform. They don't want to be blacklisted. So those people will never do what I did. And there is one video on this channel, the title of which memorably is Canadian Hitler. And it is pointing the finger at a racist, anti-Semitic, white supremacist YouTuber who became a real political leader and has, I believe, stood in 2 different elections. One I'm certain of. She stood for election at least once, but I think a second time. In no time at all, she went from being a YouTube personality to being a serious player in Canadian politics with consequences. And it really matters that we have voices on YouTube who are willing to point the finger and say in no uncertain terms, look, this woman uses coded language because she does. This woman uses so-called dog whistles and so on. But make no mistake, this is a neo-Nazi. This is what she represents politically, ethically, so on and so forth. All right. That critique is, necessary and kind of morally important to do. All right. So this comes down to 2 very simple questions. What kind of person do you want to be? And if not you, then who? We're making a transition in the 21st century. Professional journalism is dying. It used to be that there were two separate types of people in the world. There were people who did real things, and then there were journalists who wrote about it. And you can imagine in that old world of professional journalism, let's say 50 years ago, there might be someone who was making the compromises to meet with corrupt government officials so that they could get clean running water out or for some charitable, and someone who was recording what was happening and secretly handing documents to a professional journalist to write about it so that they could continue doing their work and the journalists can separately publish it and try to chase up the ends. That is gone, right? The role of the professional journalist is over. And the era of the amateur journalist, the era of each and every one of us being in our own small way a radio talk show host, is very real here and now, right? If I did not stand up and make those videos, there are quite a few pointing the finger at people and saying, look, this is real racism, this is really a problem, this really matters, all right? I think my daughter and my grandchildren would be in a position to ask me, what the hell were you doing that was so important that you didn't do this? This was on your watch, right? And the descent of societies from democracy into tyranny, whether it be democracy into fascism or democracy into communism or democracy into authoritarianism, it happens because people like you and me don't point the finger and say, hey, this is what's really going on here. This is what really matters. The most tragic thing of all when you're reading the history of the rise of Adolf Hitler isn't that there were crazy people on one extreme and crazy people on the other, but that there were all these reasonable people in the middle who just said, well, you know, it won't be that bad. You know, it'll just be a fad. This fascism thing, it'll come and go after a few years. You'll see, it won't be that bad. And obviously at that time, a small number of people had access to a printing press or a microphone at a radio station. A very small number of people would have had the option to do original research and present an informed opinion and say, no, this is not like any other fad. The nature of the threat is very real. The consequences for this are very real. And what you think is reasonable is profoundly irrational and dangerous. The excuses in the middle course you're taking, right? You can't always be right. You can always try to tell the truth. You can always try to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And you don't get to decide if you will be hated or you will be loved for that. There are university professors here, University of Victoria right now, who hate me for telling certain inconvenient truths. You don't get to choose if you're going to be hated or loved for that. But you get to choose who that person is that you see in the mirror in the morning. You get to choose who you're going to be. And when you make compromises, when you're a coward, there are terrible consequences for the character of that person you have to live with.